This 22-year-old student was involved in a horrifying cycle accident. Hundreds like him are killed or maimed on London's roads each year. Can the death toll of cyclists in the capital be halted? Almost a year ago, 22-year-old Peter Hammett was cycling along Kennington Road. It was 9:40 on a dry weekday morning. Just 2 days earlier, he'd completed a 3-year photographic degree course. That morning, he was on his way to the Polytechnic of Central London to put the finishing touches to an end-of-year exhibition. But he never got there. Peter Hammett was knocked off his bike by a 16-ton lorry as he was cycling along Kennington Road. He was crushed under the rear near-side wheels. He suffered multiple injuries and was dead on arrival at hospital. His next of kin, his brother and sister-in-law Ken and Carol Hammett, were told the news a few hours later.
People always say, you know something's happened, because the police don't usually come to your door. They came to the door, and my first reaction was that it was my wife or the children. They said, please sit down in that chair, so I knew that something terrible had happened. They said Peter had had an accident, and I said, you think to yourself, well, how bad's the accident? You think, and I said, well, how bad is he? You grasp at straws. You think, well, he can't be dead. How badly is he injured? And the policeman said, I'm sorry, he's dead, been run over. He was cycling in London. And my first reaction was, cycling in London? He said he would never cycle in London. He said it was far too dangerous.
There was a 20-year age gap between the two brothers, and ever since their mother died, Ken had felt a special responsibility for Peter.
When Mother died, she knew she was dying. I'd promised her that, or we'd promised her, that we would always look after Peter's interests.
We asked Peter if he wanted to stay on living in his mother's house or come to live with us. And he was thrilled to bits that we'd asked him to come to live with us. He didn't want to be on his own. And my daughters were thrilled. They always thought when Peter was around, everything was happening. You know, the house came alive because he was there. He got it all, really. He'd got the looks, he'd got the intelligence, he'd got the drive. You knew Peter was going to make it, whatever he did. You knew he was going to be very successful at it. And all that had gone. It had all gone in a second. And you felt it was...
I mean, every day I think about him. Every day you sort of go through part of the day and you think, oh, what about Pete? What would he be doing now? I mean, as far as we were concerned, he got such a future ahead of him. He got everything going for him, everything.
Peter took hundreds of photographs, but the irony is this is the only one he ever sold. It's on cycle safety. Peter Hammett was in fact typical of a new breed of road user in London, the young commuter cyclist. Over the last decade, the number of cyclists riding into the centre of London has increased by 300%, and the vast majority of them are in their 20s or 30s. 250,000 people now cycle in London every day. London, in fact, has been the centre of a cycling boom. But as more people have begun to cycle, concern has grown about the risks, for cyclists are particularly vulnerable.
The figures quite clearly indicate that pedal cyclists are very much more at risk on our roads than most other road users. And in fact, the official figures indicate that pedal cyclists are about 5 times as likely for every kilometre that they travel to have a road accident as a car driver, and they're about 18 times as likely to be injured in a road accident as a car driver.
Over the last decade, the number of cyclists killed or seriously injured on London's roads has risen sharply as cycling has become more popular. In 1975, 412 cyclists were killed or seriously injured. By 1983, it was 567, and a year later, 582. But in 1985, the number of serious accidents climbed steeply. 728 cyclists were killed or badly hurt, and another 3,500 were injured in cycle accidents. The accident rate for young commuter cyclists like Peter Hammett has risen even more sharply. Since 1975, the number of cyclists aged between 20 and 35 who've been involved in serious accidents has nearly quadrupled. A young nurse was fatally injured in this accident on the Edgware Road. But these figures may be a vast underestimate. Surveys have shown only a quarter of all cyclists injured in accidents report them to the police. Given these undoubted risks, the increasing popularity of cycling poses a major problem. For many years, it was thought that the city cyclist would disappear altogether as more and more people became car owners. But the cycling boom of the last few years, in particular the rise of the young commuter cyclist, seems to have changed all that. So why is it that cycling has become so popular, and why are the risks so high? Is there anything that can be done to prevent the tragic death of people like Peter Hammett? Tony Gribben, who's 28, is one of London's 80,000 commuter cyclists. Each day he cycles from his home here in Hackney across London to Camberwell, where he works as a research officer. In the last 4 years, he's had 2 serious cycle accidents, including a multiple fracture of his elbow, which still causes him pain. He says cyclists in London are constantly at risk.
Every month you have at least one near miss. I'm sure every cyclist will tell a very similar story. I don't see why I should keep off the road because motorists are being reckless or negligent. I've had one nasty experience where an articulated lorry, it came so close I came off my bike and I had to drag my bicycle from underneath the lorry as he was turning left.
But these experiences do not deter him.
I live in Hackney. It doesn't have a tube, and to get to Camberwell, which doesn't have a tube, it's more convenient for me to cycle. Economy is another reason. I find it, it's easier in my pocket to have a bicycle rather than taking public transport because transport costs are just getting so expensive.
By bicycle, Tony Gribben's journey to work takes 35 minutes, and with just the maintenance of his bike to worry about, costs him almost nothing. By public transport, the same journey would take him over an hour and 10 minutes and would cost £16 a week. So, for Tony Gribben, the advantages of cycling outweigh the risks. But he's not alone. Thousands of other Londoners are making the same calculation. Although there's been an increase overall in the number of cyclists in London over the last decade, each rise or fall in fares has been matched by a corresponding rise or fall in cycling. In October 1981, when fares fell by a third, the number of cyclists coming into central London also fell by around 1 in 3. In March 82, when fares doubled, following the defeat of the GLC's fares fair policy, the number of cyclists increased twofold. In May 83, fares were cut by a quarter, and cycling once again fell by the same amount by the end of the year. Since then, fares have risen by 16%, and cycling has increased too. What's clear is that there's a far greater crossover from public transport to cycling than from public transport to car driving. With fares likely to rise still further, the cycling boom looks set to gather speed.
Well, if the fares go up, then a lot of people who use public transport don't have cars, and they're people who are probably a little bit poorer than average, and therefore affected by high fares, and therefore they will turn to another and cheaper means of transport, in this case the bicycle. And it's worth remembering that there's something like as many bicycles hanging around London as there are cars, so a lot of people do actually have the option of cycling. So if fares go up, they'd simply turn to the bicycle.
Because many of these people, like Tony Gribben, cycle primarily to get to work more cheaply and quickly, they're often on the road when traffic is heaviest. And it's these other vehicles, cars, lorries and buses, which pose the greatest threat to the cyclist. For the motorist, no other vehicle need be involved for a serious accident to take place. The speed of his vehicle is enough to cause serious injury in the event of a crash. But for the cyclist, serious accidents invariably involve a collision between the rider and a motorised vehicle. In at least 50% of all cycle accidents, this kind of collision takes place at roundabouts or junctions. It's been calculated that 2 of the worst accident black spots for cyclists in London are here at the Elephant and Castle roundabout and at the Holland Park, Holland Road roundabout in West London. T-junctions feature in a large number of accidents. Just over a month ago, John Eversley was cycling along Whitechapel Road when a lorry turned left into New Road across his path. It was a classic T-junction accident, the sort of collision all people who cycle in London dread.
I was concentrating on riding the bike before the accident. It wasn't a case of absent-mindedness or anything like that. So as soon as I realised that the vehicle was going to move left in front of me, I knew I had to take action. And I mean, I braked and I swerved and I did things. As I was under the lorry, I was fully conscious and I knew that already a lot of my leg had been crushed. And I knew if I didn't move out of the way, I was either going to be killed or I was going to suffer even more than I was at the time. So I actually thought I'd copped it, basically.
Although he suffered terrible injuries, John Eversley feels, in retrospect, the accident could have been still worse.
I've had my right leg amputated above the knee, and I've got a fairly bad fractured elbow. I'm lucky not to have any brain injuries, chest injuries, and basically to be alive. I mean, I was conscious throughout the accident, and I know I could easily have been crushed.
This experience has reinforced his belief that motorists simply don't take cyclists into account.
Cyclists in London are basically invisible to most motorists, and I certainly don't think it's because of anything that cyclists do or don't do. I think it's about the fact that cycling is something that motorists either forget about or they've never done, or they simply just don't know what it is to cycle in a city, that they really don't see what's hazardous for a cyclist.
Philip Goodwin has found that there is a problem in the way motorists perceive cyclists.
There are 3 reasons why motorists very often just don't see cyclists. The first reason is physical visibility. That is, very often cyclists aren't wearing bright clothes or their lights aren't working. In any case, they're small. The second reason is that they're in the wrong place from the point of view of the motorist. They're on the inside instead of the outside. They're beetling in and out of the traffic. They're where they're not expected. The third reason is that motorists have a sort of blind spot, a psychological blind spot about cyclists. They don't see them as being a genuine part of traffic. They're not real road users. It's as though they weren't there at all. And these reasons combine to make a physical and a psychological invisibility of cyclists.
Research has shown that driver error of this kind is responsible for around 2/3 of all cycle accidents. But some of London's most experienced road users disagree that the motorist is solely to blame.
They tend to get very, very close to vehicles and don't leave you any manoeuvring at all, because on any vehicle, whether it's a taxi, bus, car, van, you've got blind spots. It cannot be helped. But unfortunately, a cyclist doesn't take that into consideration when they're going along.
Mainly it's just the traffic. They don't take any notice of traffic lights. They use pavements and they cut in and out of the cars. And you can't hear them, so the thing is they spend most of their time ending up being knocked over.
Cyclists only look out for themselves. They don't ever think about anybody else that's using the road apart from themselves. They think there's a brick wall in between you and them and they can do what they like, you know. Because I've knocked a couple over myself, you know, so I'm speaking from experience.
It's clear then that there's a great difference in the way cyclists and motorists regard each other's right to be on the road. This can cause conflict, with the cyclist paying the heavier cost.
The motorist resents the cyclist because he's not following the rules. He's not a real road user. He doesn't pay tax. He's overtaking on the inside instead of the outside, and he's in the way. The cyclist, on the other hand, sees himself as working hard, being wet, uncomfortable. The motorist is dry, safe, warm, comfortable, and treating the cyclist as though he was an inferior being. So there's a sort of resentment on both sides.
But however accidents happen, it's clear that the mixture between cyclists and motorists on London's congested roads is a very dangerous one. Most disturbing of all is the problem that seems to be at the heart of the rising cyclist casualty rate. This is the difficulty motorists have in noticing cyclists at all, the tendency of drivers to overlook them in favour of other vehicles. It may very well be true, as John Eversley says, that cyclists are to all intents and purposes invisible to the motorist. So what can be done to make cycling safe? Last week we visited Cambridge, a city that's probably done as much for the cyclist as any in Britain. The university city, with its 10,000 undergraduates, has a far higher proportion of cyclists than anywhere in London. Around 1 in 3 of all journeys in Cambridge are made by bicycle. Local planners have responded to this by introducing some innovatory cycle schemes. Accident black spots like this notorious left turn on Hills Road, which leads from the station to the city centre, have been tackled by differential traffic lights. They prevent cyclists from riding straight on while motorists are turning left. With lights like this, John Eversley's accident would never have happened. But reservations have begun to emerge about such imaginative measures.
Well, what we've done in the past 4 years is ad hoc solutions, meaning that at certain junctions, where the accident rate was perhaps the worst, we improved those junctions and we have taken away the accident problem at those junctions. We have got dual-use footways. We have schemes on the road themselves whereby we allow cyclists to use their own special lanes, and we have taken away the accidents at those points, but still the accident rate grows. In fact, it's increased.
For Cambridge, a city which has done so much for the cyclist, the accident figures are disturbing. In 1980, the year the council began introducing some of these measures, 184 cyclists were seriously injured. In 1982, the figure was 243, and by 1984, the last full year for which figures are available, just under 300 cyclists were seriously injured. That's a 61% increase in cycling accidents in just 4 years. When the council began to examine where the accidents were happening, they found black spots like roundabouts had become safer. However, there was a disturbingly high number of accidents on the roads that led up to them.
One must do something about the black spots, but they are a very small part of the route of a cyclist on a 4-mile journey. And if, as a result of improving those particular black spots, we find that there is a sense of false security sold to a cyclist over the whole route, then they can be counterproductive. And something else must be done in addition to the black spot problem.
Just 4 weeks ago, the council voted to spend £1.1 million on a comprehensive scheme for cyclists. It will enable them to avoid completely the busy major roads, Hills Road and Mill Road, where 30% of all cycle accidents happen. Instead, they'll be able to make their entire journey into the city centre via a special cycle bridge across the railway station and then along designated routes through quiet residential streets. For Brian Oldridge, a comprehensive solution like this offers the only hope of safety to the cyclist. No other solution seems to work for busy streets like Mill Road.
It's barely 6 metres wide. It carries 12,000 vehicles a day. It carries very heavy flows of cyclists. It's a shopping street, perhaps typical of many borough high streets in the London area. And whatever measure we try and bring in, nothing helps. If you are a cyclist on Mill Road, you are at risk. It really is as simple as that. So the problem is we've got to get them off the road altogether.
But could London accommodate ambitious schemes like the Cambridge Plan, which seeks to protect the cyclist from the start to the finish of his journey? Clearly, there would be some immediate problems. London has many thousands of cyclists travelling along an enormous number of different routes, and it's got fewer quiet residential streets close to the city centre. But that's not the end of the bad news for London's cyclists. Hammersmith and Fulham Council has taken cycle safety more seriously than almost any other London borough. Here, a special light-controlled crossing enables cyclists to avoid the busy Great West Road on their way to Hammersmith's major shopping streets. And this is the start of a special designated route which enables cyclists to ride along back streets in order to avoid the dangerous Holland Road, Holland Park roundabout. Within Hammersmith and Fulham, there are some 18 miles of cycleways like this. But surveys show that the average journey of the commuter cyclist in London is over 4 miles, often crossing 2 to 3 borough boundaries. The problems this creates in a city like London can be seen on Fulham Road, one of the major arteries used by cyclists travelling into central London from the west. Here, Hammersmith and Fulham Council, using funds and expertise provided by the GLC, installed a cycle lane to try and provide for the needs of the commuter cyclist. But at this point along the Fulham Road, the cyclist enters the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Now that the GLC has been abolished, this major road has come under the control of more than one borough. Kensington and Chelsea take a very different view of the cyclist and seem highly likely to remove the cycle lane.
They have a perfect right to move on the road if they wish. What I object to is having a reserved part of the road for that purpose. Everybody knows, and it must be quite obvious, that Fulham Road is extremely narrow. It is too narrow to allow for a reservation of that kind for cyclists. So that's why my personal preference is to see it go.
So, for London's growing number of cyclists, the prospects aren't at all good. There seem to be formidable problems in providing comprehensive schemes in London, not least because of the lack of agreement between individual boroughs about providing special facilities for the cyclist in the first place. And there's even a fear that providing piecemeal schemes at black spots, like roundabouts, may simply encourage cyclists onto roads that are still alarmingly dangerous. Indeed, it seems, if anything, London will become still more dangerous for the commuter cyclist. Before abolition, the GLC was prepared to allocate 1% of its transport budget, up to £2 million a year, to cycle schemes. Now the boroughs will have to take the lead.
It's fairly obvious that some boroughs are not very keen on cycling already, and those that are keen will become a lot less keen. Now, the reason for that is that under the old arrangements with the GLC, the borough would get 100% all the costs of any cycling scheme approved by the GLC, paid for by the GLC. So there was tremendous incentive for them to put in cycling schemes. And even so, some boroughs really didn't want to know about cycling. Now, under the new system, the maximum that any borough is likely to get is going to be about 50 or 60% through the various local authority support schemes that there are. And it's clearly going to reduce the incentive for boroughs to do anything about cycling.
In the new post-abolition mood, it's clear some borough leaders have no intention of coming to the cyclist rescue.
The motor car is probably the most important emancipating form of transport that there has ever been, and most people are very attached to their motor cars. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that motorists can have unlimited access at all times, but what I am not prepared to be a party to is making the position of motorists, which is difficult enough in London, particularly those who live in London, as in Kensington, Chelsea, I'm not prepared to see their position made more difficult.
John Eversley, who will be in hospital for many weeks to come, is only too aware of the obstacles preventing more from being done for the cyclist.
There is clearly resistance to doing anything either to make life better for pedestrians or for cyclists. And it comes from the people who are trying to move freight or passengers around in a hurry, for whom time is money, and it comes from the feeling that roads are for motorists. It's a needless waste of life and expense of me being in hospital for a long time. I feel angry that it was avoidable, in the sense that there are things that could be done that avoid accidents like that.